There are several reasons you might abandon a vehicle. It may have broken down and thereby become useless to you. It might be obsolete or outdated. It might even have just got lost one day. Unwanted or abandoned vehicles have a habit of turning up in unusual places, and when they do, they make for great stories. This video is all about the grand tales of unusual vehicles and pieces of equipment that were lost and then found once more. You could be forgiven for thinking that the object that appeared on an Arizona roadside between Phoenix and Tucson in 2017 was a piece of space-age technology that had fallen out of orbit. It certainly convinced the local press, who made inquiries to NASA after it turned up overnight in February of that year. But this object has never actually been into space. Despite its appearance, it isn't even a space capsule. It's an elaborately disguised drum from a cement mixer, and it was created by an artist living in Scottsdale. Even one of NASA's own retired scientists was taken in by the deception and called his former employers to say he feared that part of a 1960s spacecraft had finally returned to Earth. But in reality, the artifact he saw was designed by the skilled hands of Jack Millard, who wanted to provide drivers something to look at during their daily commutes. He took the drum from an abandoned cement mixer that was already standing disused in the middle of a field. It doesn't quite meet the description of abandoned space technology, but it was convincing enough to hoodwink some experts. The shell of this plane might not be much to look at now, but it went by many different names in the 1940s. Some called it the Horton Ho 229, others called it the HIX. Occasionally it was referred to at the Go-to-Go 229 rather than the Horton Ho. They all add up to the same thing. This was Hitler's attempt at a stealth fighter during the Second World War, and it's the only one of its kind that still exists today. The jet-powered plane was supposed to be able to avoid enemy radar, carry over 2,000 pounds of bombs, and travel at over 600 miles per hour. As flimsy as aspects of the design might have been, it's possible that the plane might have been able to meet the brief, but it arrived too late. The Germans were running out of time and money when the final prototype was approved, and it was found in Germany by advancing Allied forces in April 1945. Only one of the captured prototype frames still exist, and it's now undergoing restoration to see if it would have been capable of achieving its originally intended mission. Most cars have a fairly uniform design and appearance nowadays, but that hasn't always been the case. The 1940s and 1950s were an experimental time in car design, and those experiments resulted in products like this one, the 1958 Heinkel Cabin Cruiser. The oddly shaped bubble car looks like something from the animated series The Jetsons, and yet it was once a reasonably common sight on the roads. Very few examples of it still exist today, and while we'd hesitate to say that this is the very last one, it's definitely one of the last of a dying breed. The car turned up in England in 2014, where it was offered for auction. According to the seller, it had been locked up in a garage since 1971, was still fully functional and ready to drive, and hadn't been modified or refurbished since the day it was bought brand new. It would be a strange thing to buy, but in its own way, it's a piece of motoring history. It probably deserved better than being stashed away from the world for more than 40 years. While that car may or may not have been the last of its kind, this tank landing aircraft definitely is. Officially designated LCT-7074, the vessel that took part in the D-Day landings on June 7, 1944, but it's had a bizarre and checkered history since then. The ship successfully brought 10 tanks and a platoon of soldiers to the beach that day, surviving constant shelling from the German side that sank the identical vessel sailing next to it. There were once more than 800 of these boats, but this is the only one left, and we nearly lost it. After the war, the 180-foot-long vessel served a variety of purposes, including spending a brief period as a floating nightclub before it partially sank in Birkenhead docks. By that time, it was considered derelict, and it was briefly thought to be unsalvageable. A $5 million national lottery grant in 2014 changed that assessment and allowed the wreck of the ship to be restored by the National Museum of the Royal Navy. By 2019, it was in a good enough condition to land on South Sea Beach to mark the 75th anniversary of D-Day. The object found by the side of the road in Arizona might not have come from space, but unwanted spacecraft falling out of orbit have to land somewhere. And that somewhere is an uninhabited zone in the South Pacific Ocean that's become informally known as the Spacecraft Cemetery. Nobody knows for sure how many spacecraft are buried beneath the waves there, but it's at least 260. One of them is the famous Soviet space station Mir. But other prominent wrecks there include the Japanese H-2 transfer vehicle and the European Space Agency's automated transfer vehicle. The location was specifically chosen because it's in the oceanic pole of inaccessibility, the furthest possible point from any land, and far from any established shipping route. That means there's the lowest possible risk of danger as the ships are deliberately brought out of orbit and directed to crash into the waves. Even with so much care taken, there are still some people who are unhappy with this scuttling process because they feel that the broken down spaceships represent a pollution risk and a threat to aquatic life in the area. Just as old spacecraft require a dumping ground when they're no longer useful, so do old pieces of military equipment. The BDRM-2 is no different. Even though this amphibious armored patrol car is still in use in some parts of the world today. The military vehicle was designed by the Soviet Union in 1962 and remained in production until 1989. Over 30 years after the Russians declared it to be obsolete, new units are still being built in Poland. More than 38 different countries have employed variants of the Russian design, surprisingly including the United States of America. It appears that the Russians didn't destroy their stock when they stopped using them, though. They just stripped out all of the useful parts and then piled them high on top of each other at this site on the outskirts of Moscow. Nobody knows what this site is used for. It's officially designated as a car repair plant, but it appears to specialize in military vehicles. The fact that it's under armed guard and surrounded by barbed wire fences is a clue that the military won't want people to ask any further questions about it. In September 2018, the MV Alta was an everyday cargo ship sailing to the southeast of Bermuda on normal duties. By February 2020, she was washed up on the rocks of the coast of Ireland, and she'd become an international curiosity. Somehow, the abandoned ship had survived a year out on the water without a crew, and she was still in one piece. She'd come a very long way on her own. The Alta is an old ship built in 1976 and most recently sailed under the flag of Tanzania. In September 2018, she suffered a total power failure while sailing between Haiti and Greece and spent 20 days drifting on the water before the U.S. Coast Guard spotted the distressed crew and airlifted them to the safety of Puerto Rico. It was impossible to secure the ship at the time, so it was left to sail alone and was presumed to have been lost at sea until a storm deposited it on the coast of County Cork, much to the surprise of the local residents and the ship's owners. The Alta received minimal damage when it was beached and could still be sailed, but for now, it's still on the Irish coast while the authorities try to determine its fate. When she was built, the SS Thistlegorm was a British armed merchant navy ship. She only lasted a single year in that role. After launching from Sunderland in England in 1940, she was sunk in the Red Sea by German bombers in 1941 while carrying a shipment of ammunition and armored vehicles. She's now far more famous as a diving site, but she had to be found before she could become a tourist attraction, and the person who found her was the legendary French explorer Jacques Cousteau. Cousteau identified the wreck site using information provided by local fishermen in the 1950s, and managed to retrieve the ship's bell, a motorcycle, and the captain's safe from the vessel's interior. After he'd taken all he could from it, the world forgot about the ship's existence again, until nearby Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt became a popular tourist destination, and tour companies on its shore began to provide guided tours of the wreck to amateur scuba divers. Sadly, the frequent visits are damaging what's left of the Thistlegorm, and will eventually cause it to disintegrate. It was the Second World War that saw the SS Thistlegorm destroyed, but the wreck of the SS Makino is a relic of the First World War, more than 20 years earlier. During her service, she was a hospital ship, but you'd never guess that from the skeletal state of the vessel as it appears today on Australia's Fraser Island. The Makino was built in peacetime and was originally supposed to be an ocean liner for Tasman Sea cruises, with fine dining rooms and luxury accommodation. That idea went out of the window in 1915 when she was requisitioned by the Australian military and used to ferry wounded soldiers between Sydney and Melbourne. A year later, she was relocated to England and performed the same duty, carrying injured troops across the English Channel from France. She got to return to her usual duties after the war, but in 1935, she found herself caught in the middle of a cyclone out at sea. It was feared that everyone aboard was lost, but the crew was found camped out on Fraser Beach 3 days later, along with their vessel. She couldn't be refloated, and so that's where she stayed. Not every wrecked ship is forgotten or left to rot. Some of them are reimagined as museums, like the Finnish submarine Vesikko. This is a vessel with a somewhat shady past. Built in 1933 in Turku under the registration CV707, it became the prototype for the Type II German U-boat, a vessel that would do enormous damage to Allied forces during the Second World War. Between 1933 and 1936, she was on loan to the German Navy, but the Finnish took her back and officially named her Vesikko at the end of that year. Finland was banned from owning submarines by the post-war Paris peace treaties, so she was decommissioned and eventually became derelict. That's how she stayed for more than 20 years until she was located and purchased by a group of former crew members, who restored her and opened her as a museum ship in 1973. You'll find her permanently stationed on the Finnish island of Suomenlinna, where she's officially considered an extension of the Finnish National Military Museum. Aside from that honor, she's also thought to be the only remaining Type II submarine in the world. A Rolls-Royce with a round door is a concept so unique that it's practically unheard of, and so it follows that anyone who owned such a thing would take good care of it. Sadly, that's not the case. This is a one-of-a-kind vehicle, built around the frame of a 1925 Phantom I, and paired with a futuristic cabriolet body. Was made to order for a Mrs. Hugh Dillman of Detroit, Michigan, USA. Whether or not such a person ever existed is a matter of some debate, but if she did, she never got her car. Instead, it was shipped from Britain to India, and then from India to Belgium in 1934. That's where the Jonkheer Body Company got their hands on it and gave it the eye-catching bodywork that it's still sporting today. But apparently their handiwork went unappreciated. By the 1950s, it was in a New Jersey scrapyard, and somebody had painted it gold and forged documents claiming it to be the former personal vehicle of King Edward VIII of England. It was saved from the crusher and then found its way to Japan in 1991, where a private collector kept it hidden from the world for a decade. Finally, in 2001, the Peterson Museum of Los Angeles got hold of it and put it on public display. A ship launched in 1990 would be 30 years old today, but under normal circumstances it would still be expected to be out sailing somewhere. Sadly, the Slava-class Russian cruiser Ukraina hasn't led a normal life. Work on the ship started in 1983, but financial and practical issues in the Soviet Union of the time impeded its development, and it was still considered to be unfinished even when it undertook its maiden voyage 7 years later. The Soviet Union then collapsed completely, and the unwanted ship was eventually handed to Ukraine in 1993. They took ownership of it but kept it docked for 4 full years, and then decided they had no real use for it either, and so they tried to sell it. Russia didn't want it back, and neither India nor China could be persuaded to pay the asking price. Nobody's done so in 27 years since either. The ship is still at the Mykolaiv shipyard, and hasn't moved in all that time. These days, the asking price has dropped to $30 million, and it's thought that there might be some interest from the Brazilian government. But so far, they still haven't come up with an offer. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. and you will be the first to know when a new video comes out. Thank you for watching, and see you soon!